September is National Wills Month. Not getting your affairs in order can leave your family in a rather awkward position when you die. Over 70% of South Africans do not have a valid will. Let's find out how to get things in order now from Capital Legacy's Grant Fietze. Grant, a very good afternoon. Thanks so much for your time. And I think we really do need to. It's surprising that we have to remind people to actually get their estate in order, actually have a will. I mean, just tell us, how surprised are you by how many South Africans actually don't do this, that they don't have wills?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, thank you very much for having me on your show. Yeah, it is quite a shock actually that we are still in a place where 70% of South Africans don't have a will. In fact, the Master of the High Court did a survey in 2022, and they recorded that of all the deaths recorded in that year, 70% of people did not have a will, and that's just a shocking stat, and it just shows that education levels on this issue are very low.
And I mean, from what I hear from people in the know, I mean, there are many situations, like you say, where people have died, they haven't left a will, and the family is left to deal with the mess that follows. Give us some examples of just what their struggles are when the person has not left a will.
Yeah, listen, it's very different for different families in different situations. But one of the most sort of closest to home is where there's children involved. I think people don't realize that you actually always have a will. You either have your will that you've written, where you have your wishes, or you technically have a will that is dictated by the state. And so what happens if you don't have a will is that your assets, the inheritance that you intend for your family, will get distributed by a very set formula set out by the law. And so when you have children and you have a plan to leave your hard-earned inheritance to them, it may not be distributed in the way that you had hoped for. And especially if they're minor children, what happens then is that their inheritance passes to the government guardians fund. And what that means is that the guardians left behind to look after the children have to then go and apply for funding of their inheritance from the government guardians fund. And it's a nightmare that you just don't want to put your family through.
It certainly sounds like one. And speaking of guardianship, I mean, for me, that is a quandary as well. I mean, that you have to probably look at this every year to see if it needs to be updated. What's your advice there on for those who need to actually choose guardians for their children? And what do people grapple with when you sit down with them at the table?
Yes, well, there's a couple of things that you have to consider. You have to consider the age of your children. Your will basically allows you to guide who you would prefer to be the guardian of your children, but ultimately the court will then decide who they will appoint. You have to decide. You have to consider the age of the children. You have to consider whether the guardians are in a position to look after your children, whether they have space at home, and also whether they have funding. So there's another issue that people don't really think about, is that taking on children means taking on school fees and food and clothing. Potentially even they need a larger home. So funding and capital is something that people need to think about.
And in terms of drawing up that will and what you leave in there for those who are responsible enough to do this now, Grant, how detailed should it actually be? I mean, for me, I've got everything from my jewelry down to shoes and bags and who gets what. Is that overkill?
Yeah, it's probably overkill. I think our rule of thumb is keep your will simple. If it's too complicated, it can delay the process. And so we advise people to keep it as simple as possible. But in saying that, these days people have very complicated lives where there's potentially divorce, there's new families, there's stepchildren, potentially there's businesses or overseas assets. And so that's why we advise people to rather consult with a professional to get the will drafted.
And I think what deters a lot of people, Grant, is that they think that this is a very expensive process. It's going to cost them a lot. There are ways to get it done and different places to get it done. Example, Capital Legacy, you can get it done through your bank. What are the different scenarios where you can actually get your will done? And also in terms of executors of your estate and how to choose those.
Yeah. I think you mentioned something that's quite key, is that a lot of people don't get their wills done because they feel that they need more assets or more wealth. They think that wills are only for the rich and famous, which it's not. It is for everyone. And I think people also think that wills need to be complicated or that they're very expensive to get drafted. These days, there's many institutions, banks, and financial services companies that actually don't charge for the will. And so these days, it's not difficult to get your will drafted. I think the main consideration is to understand who you appoint as the executor, because your will is your voice that speaks for you when you can't, but the executor is the partner that is then going to execute on your final wishes for your family. So my advice would be to look long and hard at who the company is behind the will that is going to execute and is able to execute on the wishes in your will.
And just in terms of updating, how often should we be updating our wills? How often should we look at them?
So many people will have their wills drafted and not look at them for the next 20 or 30 years. The danger with that is that our life circumstances change. For instance, you may get married, you may have children, you may get divorced, you may acquire assets, houses, cars, property, things like that. So we advise people to at least look at their will at every major life stage. To ensure that if you were to pass away, it reflects your current wishes for the stage that you're in. There can be nothing worse. For example, if you get divorced but you haven't updated your will, you pass away, and we've seen cases like this where the old will still reflects that everything goes to the ex-spouse. And that becomes an absolute disaster.
I can only imagine. And of course, leaving your wishes and your instructions on a paper napkin don't count anymore?
It doesn't count.
Okay.
It doesn't count. Please don't do that.
All right. Thanks very much for that. Head of Marketing at Capital Legacy, Grant Fietze, there on it being Wills Month this September.